Excellency, let us make currency instead of swords, for it is wealth that moves the world, and profit that rules it.
Strategy games have been a part of PC gaming since the very beginning. Rather than playing a direct role like in first-person shooters where fast reflexes rule, strategy games were all about outsmarting your opponent, akin to their earlier board game counterparts like Risk or the classic chess. With the advancement of technology, AI, and processing power's capabilities, many new subgenres of PC strategy games made their way to store shelves. One of the most successful subgenres was real-time strategy, with the player's ability to control the game at the same time as other human and AI players, giving an entirely new experience. Another spawned genre, better described as a niche, was 4X, short for Explore, Expand, Exploit, and Exterminate, where the player would be in control of an empire rather than just combat assets. 4X was a term first coined by Alan Emmerich during the preview for Master of Orion in 1993, which, like most early 4X games, was turn-based. The 4X genre has only had relatively few successful titles, let alone series, with some of the oldest and most popular being the real-time tactics Total War and turn-based Sid Meier's Civilization. But in 2008, Ironclad Games, founded 5 years prior in 2003, would finally release their very first game, Sins of a Solar Empire. Described by Ironclad as an RT4X, an amalgamation of contemporary real-time strategy games with resource collection and building structures to train units and advanced technology through an expansive tech tree, and 4X empire building, with your culture and race populating and ruling over the celestial bodies you conquer, and the possibility of engaging in diplomacy with other civilizations and factions. The gameplay's fundamentals weren't too different from that of other RTS games, with 3 main resource types: credits, metal, and crystal, with credits being gained from your population, and metal and crystal being mined from deposits found in most gravity wells, with an always accessible black market, allowing you to buy and sell resources as needed. But each transaction will cause the market's buy and sell prices to fluctuate, meaning your abundance of one resource may not translate to the amount of something else you need. The ship or unit capacity was one aspect of the game fairly different from most other contemporary titles. There were 2 separate supplies, one being simply titled Supply Points, which are used for every ship you build, and the other Capital Ship Crews. These are vastly fewer and are used, obviously, for the construction of capital ships. Rather than building structures to increase these points like in most other RTS games, they're increased through research, though higher-tier research options do require the construction of civil and military labs. But increasing the supply limit will also increase your unit's upkeep, dealing a serious and permanent blow to your economy. Planets and other inhabitable celestial bodies can hold a finite amount of buildings, so choosing what to build and where is as much a strategic decision as any other move in the game. But like the population or supply limits, there's also 2 different caps for the types of buildings you can construct per gravity well, classified as civilian logistical and military tactical. Civilian buildings generally include ship production factories, trade ports for trade routes between planets, research laboratories, and cultural broadcast stations used to spread your influence throughout the galaxy, and possibly even cause rival planets to revolt against their own empire. Military tactical constructions are generally defensive structures like orbital weapons platforms, with exceptions like each race's unique superweapon, and would be further expanded through DLC. Though diplomacy and cooperation is a viable strategy, and even a type of victory that can be achieved, a large portion of the game will usually be spent in combat, but with most downtime consisting of building and rebuilding your fleet, shoring up your defenses, and waiting for research to finally finish. Almost every aspect of the game takes significant amounts of time. This was one of the few but very common complaints. Even games with only a handful of players could take up to several hours. This would somewhat be remedied with a later patch, allowing for players to control the game speed. But this was only usable when playing against the AI. There was an option to adjust most of the settings per match, like ship speed and how quickly you gather resources. The drawback with this was that it's unchangeable once the game has started, and it couldn't go anywhere near as fast as the speed controls allowed. Even so, the game won several awards, including Game Trailer's Best Strategy Game of the Year and IGN's Best PC Game of the Year, as well as equally high praise from its player base. 7 months after its release, Stardock Entertainment, the game's publisher, would state that the game had sold over 500,000 copies, all on a budget of less than $1 million. Even with all of the gaming press's adulation and great reception from the gamers themselves, there was still one other minor but common complaint. Sins of a Solar Empire, with all of its grandeur and lore surrounding the races that make up the playable empires, had no story or campaign mode to experience. Especially considering the third DLC's new rebel factions for each race. Unless actively sought out, the only thing gamers would ever know about these empires and their war was the text written about them on the Empire selection screen, and the general synopsis of the skippable trailer that played when starting up the game. Instead, gamers play long after all of the events of the story have taken place, and find themselves in the middle of the war those events caused. This is a common theme for multiplayer games and strategy game skirmish modes, but seldom does an RTS, especially one with such an interesting premise, completely forego a campaign that would allow gamers to play out these events firsthand. While the absence of a campaign was considered by many to be a negative, not only for the lack of extra content, but also for the dearth of storytelling as previously stated, there are those of the opinion that campaigns are nothing more than long tutorials, and they're perfectly fine with the game not having one. In this video, we'll go through the lore and timeline of events provided to us by Ironclad Games to fully appreciate the story of Sins of a Solar Empire and the campaign we never got. The ancient Vasari Empire once ruled over countless worlds, brought hundreds of alien races under its control, and showed no signs of slowing down. Most species encountered were young enough to be subjugated peacefully, although some resisted and were harshly enslaved. Once conquered, most species were integrated into the Vasari social structures as valued citizens. The Vasari locked each planet down and ruled from vast orbital structures, finding a minimal surface presence more effective for both production and the minimization of rebellion. Though their advanced technology and terrifying military were enough to conquer the galaxy, there was something far worse on its way. Something no true witness would ever live to speak of. When the first of the inner planets fell, analysts initially assumed that the local species had somehow managed to rebel. They immediately requested a wing of the Dark Fleet to restore order, but no status reports were ever received. Instead, 3 more planets dropped from the communications grid. The probability of multiple simultaneous and successful rebellions was exceptionally remote. Internal intelligence concluded that a renegade force from within the Vasari engineered a revolt. As deliberations proceeded on how best to deal with the traitorous acts, another series of planets were lost, including their world of origin. The unknown enemy's rate of expansion far exceeded even that of the entire Dark Fleet. As a last resort, the Dark Fleet Veer brought the bulk of their forces back from the expansionary frontier and massed for a blind assault on whatever was eating its way out from the central worlds. The inhabitants of a perimeter planet were surprised when a single warship of the Dark Fleet appeared out of phase space, bearing signs of heavy damage. Their curiosity and confusion quickly gave way to fear when they boarded the ship and found the crew apparently mad with terror. In a rare act of autonomy, the colony decided it would be best to take precautions and temporarily evacuated to a system far from the Empire. The refugees waited for signs of a safe return, but instead, the signal from their warning beacons ceased. The lifetimes of the warning beacons were used to estimate the speed of the threat. It would not be long before their current position would be compromised. Additional beacons were placed at their current location, and the group moved on to a considerably further destination. Settling for a time, the refugees started to build colonies, construct new ships, and extract resources. Ultimately, their goal was to uncover the nature of the threat, to research technologies that might aid in its destruction, and to restore the rule of the Empire. For the next 10,000 years, the Vasari refugee fleet traveled from system to system, dropping warning beacons on their way, spending only enough time to replenish their resources before moving on. No matter how far the Vasari traveled, their warning beacons fell silent. Their unknown adversaries continues its march towards their extermination. The history of the TEC began more than 1,000 years ago, during the foundation of the trade order by economically driven settlers. Established on strict principles of economic and codes of behavior, the trader worlds began to expand, making the trade order an industrial and commercial juggernaut. However, outside of the trader's core principles, each member world maintained its own interests, form of government, economic systems, and culture. It was during this early period of the trade order that something unique took place, which would later reshape the galaxy. During a routine exploratory expedition to recruit new trading partners, emissaries from the Order discovered a dry desert world orbiting a red giant, whereupon further scans discovered a thriving civilization. Eager to integrate this prosperous civilization into the trade order, emissaries established communications with the civilization's leaders from orbit. However, the leaders turned down the membership offer. Not to be dissuaded, the trade order sent several market research teams to the desert planet in order to gather data that could be used to formulate a more enticing strategy for this civilization. Unfortunately, dreams of integration quickly turned to horror upon landing on the planet. Here the teams discovered a colony of people practicing the most heinous forms of scientific and social deviancy. Invasive cerebral integration technologies, unrestricted biological experimentation, strange forms of collectivism, and wholesale usage of countless neurochemicals were but a few of the transgressions. All these deviancies and more violated the codes and principles of personal freedoms that made up the very foundation of the trade order. Having received only a single incomplete report of this disturbing information, the emissaries returned to trader space. Upon their return, their news sent shockwaves throughout the trader worlds, who voted overwhelmingly to take control of this desert planet and exile their twisted cousins to the far reaches of space. In time, this exiled civilization was forgotten. Over the next 1,000 years, the trade order went on in relative peace and prosperity, a golden age for mankind. War became a thing read about only in history books and seen in holovids. The rare heated dispute was settled in trader-sanctioned courts, and merchant fleets filled the phase lanes with goods, while the worst thing one could worry about was the occasional raid by bands of marauding pirates in the trade lanes, easily dealt with by local defense fleets. The Advent evolved well before recorded history. It is said that it began as one of the many broken peoples who sought spiritual escape on peripheral worlds following the Great Wars. The earliest known records of the Advent can be traced back to slightly after the formation of the trade order. When the Trade Order forced the ancestors of the Advent from its homeworld, it made an indelible scar upon the population's psyche. An etching was created upon Advent citizens in all the following centuries to exact retribution upon their enemy and assume their rightful place in the galaxy. This powerful drive for revenge pushed the Advent even further in its practices, advancing its technology level far beyond anything the traders could have imagined. Over the next 1,000 years, the Advent would use all the resources at its disposal to create frightening new weapons and abilities powered by its extremely advanced psi-tech. With its resources exhausted and an arsenal to wield, the highest coalescence synthesized the will of the Unity and determined the time to return the people to their original homeworld to fulfill their prophecies of dominion. The Vasari Exodus fleet arrived in Trader space and began the same cycle they had completed countless times for the past 10,000 years. They were confident in their ability to quickly deal with the locals. Initially, the victories were painless. The scouts alone procured the initial settlements. But as time went on, it became clear that the local spacefaring species would not be so easy to eliminate. The Trade Order's golden age came to an abrupt end with the arrival of the Vasari Empire. With no defenses and constant political infighting between the Trade Order's representatives and numerous politicians, the Vasari swept the Order's ships aside with ease. They had forgotten their ancient history of war and replaced it with a future of endless prosperity. The arrival of the Vasari caught the traders completely unprepared. Advanced exploratory waves from the Vasari Exodus fleet hastily crushed and colonized over a dozen worlds. Political infighting amongst the Trade Order representatives and the independent Opulencia delayed the first military response by months. Finally, they sent everything they had to repel the invaders, a cobbled band of ships designed to combat piracy. The untrained, undisciplined, and poorly equipped crews met a swift demise. Disasters continued for years, but the resilient traders slowly learned to apply their perfection of the economic engine into an ever more powerful war machine. Factories, trade routes, and savvy businessmen were now one with starbases, supply lines, and master tacticians. Unfortunately, the disastrously poor cohesion of the independently operated planetary fleets often negated this progress. As the Vasari approached the central worlds, it became clear that their advance could not be stopped without higher levels of coordination. The Trade Order could not fulfill this role because its mandate forbade interference with sovereign rights of the member planets. In a last-ditch effort to turn the tide, the Trade Order sanctioned the creation of the Trader Emergency Coalition to combat the alien threat, despite strong opposition to the loss of planetary autonomy. The TEC quickly learned to marshal the vast industrial resources of the trader worlds towards military production and used their new war engine to finally stall the Vasari attack. The Vasari were running from an unknown threat that eradicated their entire empire. The trader worlds were defending themselves from an alien whose only interaction with them has been one of enslavement, subjugation, and annihilation. Both sides were fighting for their very existence. But soon, another side would enter the fray. One coming for revenge. It wasn't until 10 years after the Vasari pushed into trader space that a new enemy arrived on the eastern fringe. The exiled have returned, and quickly gain a foothold in trader territory before the TEC would be able to react and halt their advance. Their forces stretched thin from defending two fronts. The Vasari seized the opportunity and advanced against the coalition. Though the Advent had come for their revenge against the TEC, they claimed these planets for themselves, not only as their rightful rulers, but also from their desperate need for resources. As such, they couldn't allow the Vasari to lay roots in the sector, and so they divided their fleet to start a new front against them as well. The war would rage on for 5 long years before it would be grounded to a stalemate. With stable battle lines and fronts forming, the TEC would construct their greatest defensive installations, star bases, to further reinforce their positions. The Advent and Vasari would follow suit, building grand defenses of their own that were just as effective. No ground could be gained without withstanding potentially catastrophic casualties for both sides. The Advent couldn't take their revenge on the TEC or conquer Vasari territory. The Vasari couldn't gather their needed resources from the other's territory and withdraw from the war to continue their cycle of perpetually fleeing from the unknown enemy that eradicated their once massive empire and fleet. The TEC couldn't reclaim the worlds they lost and continuously suffered through political and social pressures that opposed their loss of freedom and prosperity to a sort of military dictatorship. All had lost significant lives and resources, but there was no end to the conflict anywhere in sight. Positions grew ever more entrenched, and what little resources the three had left were dwindling. 10 more years of no significant gains for any of them, and some began to wonder. Many of those in the Traitor Emergency Coalition feared that their people were losing their identity, while others felt their leaders failed them after promising safety that wasn't delivered. Some members of the Advent started to wonder if their course of vengeance was the right one to follow, while the Vasari still simply wanted to escape the region with as many resources as possible. Such conditions led to the opening of talks between the 3 major races for the first time, in the hopes that their envoys would finally bring peace. They tried and failed, again and again. Regularly, envoys would trade places with strike groups. Offers of a ceasefire would be replaced with demands for blood, and shakily formed pacts would dissolve in the fires of planetary bombardments. This continued another 5 long years, until the division created by this long and arduous war within each of the races would finally expand the war once again. In the face of increasing internal tensions, 2 conflicting philosophies began to develop in the TEC. There were loyalists who wished to retreat into isolation by fortifying their defenses in hopes the war would finish itself. In opposition to the isolationists were rebels who wanted vengeance for the atrocities inflicted upon humanity by the invading Advent and Vasari through the 25 years of brutal war, and were grimly willing to ensure that the TEC emerged victorious by being as ruthless to their alien and deviant enemies as the invaders were during the terrible early invasions. After the fortifications of their systems, diplomacy was finally given a chance. The Vasari knew the enemy was going to arrive soon, and a consensus on what to do needed to be made. From here, the internal workings of the Vasari shifted and 2 philosophies developed. One being the original concept of evacuate, siphon, run, and the other belief that the Vasari needed to stop running and needed to make a stand against the ancient enemy alongside the Advent and the TEC. The 2 philosophies eventually split the Vasari fleet in 2 as they parted ways. After years of growing sentiment that they have lost their true purpose, the Advent coalescence began to turn on each other. The Loyalists seek only to continue their quest for dominance over the lesser species, and to exact vengeance upon those who banished them and left them for ruin. The rebels, who sense corruption within the unity, driving the Advent's mad hunger for retribution, seek to cleanse the unity of such deviation from its teachings, and to establish diplomatic, if not peaceful, relations with the TEC and the Vasari. And that marks the end for the Sins of a Solar Empire story. As I said towards the beginning of this video, some people say they're fine with not having a campaign since they're nothing more than long tutorials. But I fully stand by my opinion that this would have potentially made for an excellent campaign experience. The story is definitely worth telling, and it's an absolute travesty that only the people that look it up and read through all of it will ever know about it. Well, those people and the people that watch this video. So if you know anyone you think would enjoy hearing about it, maybe hit the share button and, let them know about it. Please. Also, real quick, I was recently brought into this Nexus.gg thing, and it's pretty interesting. It's one of those ways you can support content creators without actually having to donate money to them. I'll give you a quick look at it, and don't worry, this will be quick. Here's my page on the site. As you can see, there are some games. These are games that I'm playing, will be playing, or have made videos on. If you see one you like and would want to buy, just click on it. You can see all the relevant info, plus one of the videos I've done on it, as well as it showing you that if you buy the game from this page, I'll get a portion of the proceeds. These games are almost always the same price as they are everywhere else, and sometimes they're even cheaper because they do sales. So if you buy it from my page, you pay the same price you would normally, except now you're also supporting the channel. There's also a tip thing, but that's whatever, just pointing out how it all works. Of course, as you can see, games like this will get you a Steam key, so it's not some whole new platform you have to deal with, it's just through Steam. So if you want to check that out, I would appreciate it, and I'll leave a link down in the description below, but of course, I'm certainly not expecting anything from you. I'm just glad you're here checking out this video, which hopefully you enjoyed. But back to being serious, I do want your input on something. Clearly, this story will never be told in a game, since the one they made about it doesn't even include it. But if they ever make a Sins of a Solar Empire 2, and it includes a campaign, and I really hope they do, where do you think the story is going to go? Or at least, where do you hope it's going to go? I have several ideas. I'll just toss out a few of them because I don't want to make this video too terribly long. First off, it's going to take place with an entirely different set of races or with only one familiar race, and I don't know if it would be a prequel or a sequel, where maybe it follows the events the Advent went through when they were first exiled, or the Vasari during the events of their planets disappearing, but like it's a small Vasari Dark Fleet detachment coming to quell rebellions, which if you think about it, would kind of have the same story arc the first one has, where a technologically superior but understrength alien takes on two other races, where you're all fighting over resources to continue your agenda, but there's this hidden enemy approaching. Or maybe it'll take place in the future where it's mostly the same, but instead of pirates, it's the hidden enemy's scout forces that come and wreak havoc every now and again. Or it's simply going to be a continuation of the first game story, but the pirates are the hidden fleet like in my second thought, and some other races that are also running from them are added in. But all of the races, specifically the TEC, are much more advanced in technology, specifically the TEC because they're the ones in the first one that are severely lacking in that aspect. But what do you think it could be? The lore is pretty awesome, and I'd genuinely be interested to hear your ideas for what might come next. But that's it for this one. Hope you liked it because I tried to build off of how I did the Kenshi the making of video, and I thought it came together pretty well, and I improved in some places that the other video was lacking in. Still kinda new around here, so I'm still learning. Also, I know a lot of the footage was stock footage, but you have to understand, I was making a video for something that literally doesn't exist. The campaign doesn't exist. There's no cutscenes or anything like that, so I had to get creative. But, yeah. Alright, genuinely at the end this time. Roll the outro. If you made it this far into the video, please remember to leave a like. And if you want to see content like this and more, subscribe to the channel. This is Mitchell Godsend. Have a good one.